So we're going to talk about setting a vision for volunteer engagement today. We're going to be here for no longer than an hour. So it will allow those of you that haven't had lunch in the UK yet to get away and get your bellies full. We're going to take a little bit of what we're going to talk about actually out of, he holds up for promotional purposes, the From the Top Down book. If you're not familiar with the From the Top Down book, really recommend this as a fantastic resource to you. It was originally written in the late 1980s by the late and much missed Susan J. Ellis, who was a consultant based in Philadelphia in the USA. And she wrote this book for chief execs, senior leaders, boards, to help them to understand both the culture, but the practical actions that they could take to create a really good volunteer engagement environment in their organizations. It's been republished a couple of times since then and updated, most recently 10 years ago, when Susan and I put together on the first ever UK version of the book. You can find the book, I'd love to say, in all good bookstores. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on my website, robjacksonconsulting.com as well. And if you see down the bottom of that title slide, you will see a link to a link tree. That will also include a link to the book too. You will get every single slide that you see on the screen today as a handout after this session. And Paula will arrange to get all of that out to you. And that does include my contact details at the end of it as well. So what we are going to do during the course of this session is I will just explain a little bit more about me in a second, and then we'll jump into talking about the content. So my background, if you've not come across me before, hello, I'm Rob. I have over 30 years working in the volunteer engagement sector. So I started in student volunteering in the early to mid 1990s, worked my way through a number of volunteer engagement roles in service delivery and fundraising marketing, before going on and being part of the senior leadership team at Volunteering England. I left there 14 years ago now and have been a freelance trainer, consultant, speaker, and writer ever since. So I have a blog, I have a podcast, and I work with clients large and small, predominantly in the UK, but also overseas, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand principally, on all kinds of issues to do with volunteer engagement. But my particular enthusiasm is around strategic volunteer engagement. And that really takes two forms. One is helping people understand the external environment that we all live in, the fast changing world that we occupy, and how those trends and issues that we see in societies around the world are impacting on people's availability and willingness to both volunteer and continue to volunteer. The second is around helping organizations get better at developing and implementing volunteering strategies. And really what we're going to be focusing on today is an early part of that process. So something that, again, Susan talks about in the From the Top Down book, and I have used with clients in a variety of different settings to start them off on what has predominantly been a successful volunteer strategy journey. There are a couple of points where we come through today where I will ask you just to chip in on the chat with some thoughts. So if you are not familiar with the webinar platform, please note the distinction, as Paula said earlier, between the chat and the Q&A. Questions for later on, stick in the Q&A. Anything else, stick in the chat. Feel free to chat amongst yourselves and connect with each other and make new connections as we go through. So in terms of content for the session, I'm going to really work through some of what I do on a session around influencing, which is about how to set a vision for volunteer engagement. So we're going to look at why a vision is important. We're going to look about how it connects to both a volunteer strategy and an organizational strategy. We'll then talk about the kind of key question that you can ask to start thinking about a vision for volunteer engagement, share a couple of examples and some principles, a little bit of an action list for you to take away after today, and then we will throw it open for Q&A. So that's how the next few minutes are due to pan out. So in terms of why this is important, I want to share a quote from my colleague and good friend, Andy Fryer, who represents Better Impact in Australia. He said these words a number of years ago now. They're certainly not contemporary, but their application definitely is. And Andy said, when I talk about the evolution of volunteer management, I talk historically about how we've evolved from being a people profession to a paper profession, an evolution that moved us away from primarily having a focus on the volunteer to one where our focus is now on the process. For a while, we had this balance right, but in my opinion, we've gone too far. It is time for a new evolutionary direction. We need to find ways to become a persuasive profession. We need to learn to influence, to develop key relationships instead of simply just adding another volunteer to the team. And I think in the time that Andy's been in the field, and indeed I've been in the field, we've definitely seen that evolution taking place. When I started some 31 years ago, it was quite common for the volunteer manager to be responsible for all the volunteers in the organisation, and indeed to line manage many of those volunteers in a way that our human resource management colleagues would never line manage all the paid staff. But as organisations have grown and adapted and changed, and particularly those that involve paid staff, we've shifted to a slightly different perspective, where the volunteer manager is as much about influencing peers, it's as much about influencing up, and it's as much about influencing across to try and get people on side with volunteering. And I think particularly for some organisations at the moment where the financial challenges that many non-profits face mean that the volunteer management resource may be reduced compared to what it was a few years ago, we need to try and help influence people and get them on side and sell them on the benefits of supporting our organisation's volunteer engagement efforts. So that then means that we need to have some sort of vision. We need to have some sort of clarity around actually why volunteering is important, because we understand that it takes a whole village to raise a child, so it takes a whole organisation to effectively engage volunteers. It does not matter how brilliant you are as a volunteer manager, you alone cannot do everything when it comes to engaging volunteers. It takes everybody's attention. Just as a simple example, you're spending an hour on your professional development as part of this workshop. This probably means that somebody else is answering the phone, dealing with the emails from prospective volunteers. So somebody else needs to be covering that responsibility for you. So right from the very top of the organisation, as From the Top Down suggests, right through to the very bottom, however flat or hierarchical your system is, you need to make sure that everybody is bought into the importance of volunteer engagement and knows how they can support that. And that's really where the vision comes in. Setting a vision for volunteer engagement helps us to influence others. It gives a shared view of the future for us to rally behind, just as our organisation vision and mission is hopefully clear on why we exist and the changed world that we want to bring about. So setting that vision for volunteer engagement helps ideally to align the whole organisation towards volunteer engagement success as a strategic priority towards fulfilling the organisation's mission. And really importantly, what a really good vision does is it connects your volunteer strategy, if you have one, with your organisational strategy. In my years of consulting and working with organisations, I've seen some that have a really good volunteer strategy, but there isn't a really clear link between that volunteer strategy and the organisational strategy, the reason why the organisation exists. And the vision can help to bridge that gap, can help to provide that link. And the easiest way I can do it is in one of those, I can explain that, is in one of those really cheesy kind of consultancy terms and examples that if you've heard me speak on something like this before, you will know I hate using because they're so cliche, but actually are really useful for helping us to understand where the parts of this all fit together. And so if I put this diagram up, I will explain it as I go along. So at the top, we have our organizational strategy, the reason why we exist, and our organizational priorities and plan for how we are going to realize that vision. At the bottom, we have our volunteer strategy, and that should be about connecting why we need to recruit volunteers, why we need to curate a positive experience for them, and how that connects to the organizational strategy. If you consider those, here comes the cheesy analogy, 2 slices of bread, then the vision in the middle is the jam, or for our American colleagues, the jelly, that sits in the middle of that sandwich, that glues those 2 pieces together, the organizational strategy and the volunteer strategy, with the vision for volunteer engagement providing the glue in the middle, the jam, the jelly in the middle. And whilst I can't hear you all, I can probably identify psychologically with the groans of that analogy. So I do apologize for it as we go along. So how do we get into developing that volunteering strategy in the first place? Our starting point is to think about actually why we involve volunteers in the first place. Because if we can be clear in our organizations about why we involve volunteers, then we can start to set out a vision for how we want to see that happen. And that leads us into a really simple question. And it's a question that we should be asking ourselves regularly. And unfortunately, my experience is this question doesn't get asked very often or at all. And if it does, it's something that we tend to consider in our volunteer engagement roles, but others don't necessarily consider. And as well as being the jam in that sandwich, having a really clear vision for volunteering, as we'll see later on, can help solve some of the other volunteer management challenges that we might experience. So this is the question that Susan originally posited in the From the Top Down book, and I regularly use. And I've just noticed the comment in there. Ian, thank you for mentioning Marmite in there. You may need to explain that for our American colleagues, because not everybody understands what Marmite is from my experience. So thank you for that, and good to see you. So the question is simply this. If your organization had access to all the money you could ever want, would you still involve volunteers? And if so, why? Now, really importantly, that question is not would you, as the volunteer engagement professional, still involve volunteers? Hopefully you would, because that's why you have a job. Nor is it would people still want to volunteer with you? Because most of us don't exist as an organization to provide people with an opportunity to volunteer. We exist to tackle some kind of social ill, to tackle some kind of social problem, and volunteers, to be really, really crude and blunt for a moment, are a means to an end to achieve that. So I would like you just to reflect for a moment in your own heads. If your organization, think about that maybe if your board or your senior leadership team were suddenly presented, it's a thought experiment, not reality, with a situation where you had a never-ending supply of cash, do you think your organization would still involve volunteers? So maybe what you could do in the chat is just quickly put, yes, I do, or no, I don't. Do you simple yes or no in the chat as to whether your organization would involve volunteers? For those that are querying Marmite, now I've brought it up, it is a byproduct of the beer brewing process that produces a black salty spread that people eat on toast, and is marketed in the UK as you either love it or you hate it. In America, in Australia, sorry, they have an equivalent called Vegemite. So we've got, now that you've learned that, if nothing else, you've learned that. Yeast extract, thank you, Ian. So we've got lots of yeses in there. We've got a few no's. Thank you, Heather, for being brave and putting no in there. I think the reality is that for some organizations, they might actually choose the simple path. They might say, actually, do you know what? If we could just pay people, we could control them much better. We'd be able to, once you pay people, you can be more precise about what it is that you want them to do. They're going to turn up regularly. They're going to do everything that you want them to do. Sometimes I think the thinking behind that is a little bit flawed. We don't come to organizations and success in the nonprofit sector by threatening not to pay people. And there's a whole now separate conversational thread going on about Marmite, blimey. We've really started something there. Thanks, Ian. So there's a whole kind of thing there that we've got around putting people, we don't really get the best out of people by kind of threatening not to pay them, but it is a valid argument. Some organizations would prefer just to pay people. If, however, you, like the majority of you that have commented in the chat, have said yes, why do you think the organisation would still involve volunteers. What is it that volunteers bring to your organisation that paid staff do not, or paid staff cannot? So we've got volunteers as a future workforce in the National Health Service. Really great point from Angela there. Percentage of volunteers who forget to come in or cancel at the last minute is lower than some staff. That's a really important point to hold on to in this. Thank you, Angela. Volunteers bring a different perspective than paid staff, engagement with broader community. Those are all really, really good things. Passion, thank you for putting that one, Bernie, in there. People quite often mention passion, and I think it's a really important one because you're right, volunteers do bring passion and enthusiasm to the work. I think it's one we have to be slightly cautious with, though, simply for the reason that when we say volunteers are passionate about what they do, there's a risk that we could be seen to be implying that paid staff are not passionate about what they do. And kind of somewhat jokingly, I say I don't think any of us work in the non-profit sector for the money. The money's nice, of course, but the passion is that should at least still be there from some of the paid staff. So we're going to be slightly cautious about that one, but really great point. Glad you brought it up. Lived experience. Thank you, Julia. Hello. Personal experience. Volunteers are word of mouth. Yes, always the most powerful form of marketing. Gives purpose to people, young people giving a fresh approach, donation of time, enthusiasm, problem solving, engagement of service users, a really good view there about the lived experience point again. I was about to say I had that for lunch, but that's Ian carrying on talking about Marmite, so sorry about that. Health benefits for volunteers, yeah, which is a good thing for you as a health organisation. Really, really important that sometimes by engaging people in the very act of volunteering, we can deliver something for the community that may not be directly related to the reason why we exist, although it would if you're a health organisation, but can actually really benefit the community more broadly. Thank you for all of those reasons. That's really, really good. You're absolutely right. All of those are really important things. And it's a good question to ask. And it's a good question when you do it in your organizations to maybe pick up and challenge people. So if people say, well, volunteers bring a particular set of skills to the organization, well, they do, but we could also pay for those skills. So what is it about those skills being brought by volunteers that is uniquely different? So just a prompt for you to think about when you're doing this in your organizations. What I want to do is share a couple of examples with you where I've asked that question in an organization that I've worked with on a piece of volunteer strategy work, and share with you what they came out with as part of that process. So 2 examples. The first is going to be from an organization called Sustrans. Sustrans operate here in the UK. They're an active travel organisation, so they promote cycling and walking over using cars and vehicles. And the other one is Bowel Cancer UK, which supports inevitably people experiencing bowel cancer and their families. So here is the first example when we did this with Sustrans. So they came out with these 5 things. Volunteers help broaden our voice and our reach, enhancing the credibility of our work and enabling us to be for everyone. So for everyone is the DEI, EDI, we call it here in the UK, but for those of you in North America, the DEI agenda for the organisation. Volunteers connect us to places, people and society, building the capacity of local communities through their passion for and knowledge of where they live. Volunteers bring a flexibility, knowledge and skills that we would struggle to access in any other way. Volunteers are critical friends, informing us and keeping us accountable. And volunteers have a long-term commitment to place, helping to ensure a legacy of our work. So for an organisation like Sustrans, where they may be going to a neighbourhood for a comparatively short period of time, it's the people who live there who choose to get engaged as volunteers who maintain that longer commitment to the work. For Bowel Cancer UK, and again, don't worry if you've not written all of those down or you've not managed to screenshot it yet, you will get these in a handout afterwards. For Bowel Cancer UK, these were the 4 things that they came up with. And you'll see some similarities inevitably. Volunteers bring an authenticity and a credibility to what we do, freely choosing to give their time to support our work. Volunteers often have a lived experience of bowel cancer, either as patients or family, friends, carers, and so enhance our understanding of and empathy for those with the disease. Volunteers give us access to a wide network of skills and connections in local communities across the UK, allowing us to reach a bigger audience and to advocate for our cause to that broad audience. And volunteers are critical friends, informing our work, enhancing our transparency, helping us to innovate, keeping us accountable to those we serve, and enhancing the culture and feel of the organisation. Just to highlight a couple of things on that last point from the Bowel Cancer UK example, enhancing the culture and feel of the organisation. I did this with another organisation not that long ago. One of the points that their paid staff came out with when faced with that question was actually the fact that being in a workplace with volunteers around is a more pleasurable experience than being in a workplace where volunteers weren't present. That was really, really important to them. And just also to highlight that little 4 words of helping us to innovate. I think that was really good that Bowel Cancer UK picked that out. Paid staff do not have a monopoly on creativity and innovation. And actually, if we tap into the creativity and the different perspectives that volunteers bring, some of the points that you made in the chat reflect this as well, then we can unlock new ideas, new solutions to the challenges that we face and take up and seize new opportunities. Now, both of these organisations, both Sustrans, which was that example, and also Bowel Cancer UK, developed these, what we called sets of fundamentals, effectively a vision for volunteering, and they set that at the core of their volunteering strategy. They made sure that these were things that everybody understood in the organisation. They were covered in paid staff and volunteer induction for new intake. They were covered in training. Volunteers were clearly communicated these things to them so that when they used their voices to do word of mouth recruitment, they could talk about actually the contribution that volunteers make to an organisation. These principles have been used by both of these organisations to help make decisions about what work needs to be done in the future. So when a new project comes along, they don't create roles for paid staff and then volunteers come as an afterthought. These principles get baked in right from the very start. Based on these principles, what is it that volunteers could do to contribute to this project? Not, as I say, as an afterthought once the paid staff have been allocated roles, but really recognizing that volunteers bring something unique, something different, something incredibly valuable to an organization. They can also really help as well with dealing with paid staff volunteer tensions. So none of these statements you'll notice say the reason why our organisation involves volunteers is to put paid staff out of a job, because very few people ever volunteer to displace paid staff from a role. They're here and we can understand these reasons why they're here, and you can use those as a kind of balance, a check and balance when your organisation is perhaps downsizing or thinking about how things should be done in future. And we'll come back briefly to think about why we might employ people in a minute. So with those principles in place, what we talk about in the From the Top Down book, Susan Ellis and myself, we talk about some prompts for this kind of discussion. It's not an exhaustive list, it's not even the full list of what's in the book, but for the benefit of the time that we've got available to us today, and also the space on a slide, this is just to highlight some of them. So first of all, we talk about first choice reasons. These are some of the reasons we want high up there in the reasons why our organisation might involve volunteers. These are the kind of things that volunteers might uniquely bring to our work. And I'll just quickly explain each of those in turn. So some of you mentioned this, although not necessarily with these words in the responses to the question earlier in the chat, which was unsalaried credibility. The fact that a volunteer is not paid by definition brings them a credibility, real or perceived, with the client group or the general public that paid staff do not have. So the example I always give, and some of you may have heard me use this one before, is when I worked many, many years ago now, the early part of my career, for a children's services organisation here in the UK called Barnardo's. Barnardo's had a project amongst many projects that supported young people making the transition from a life in the care system to independent living at the age of 18. And those young people were supported, as they have been through most of their lives, by teams of incredibly professional, fantastic, wonderful, paid social workers. They were also supported by volunteer mentors and befrienders. And the feedback we got from the young people who that service was geared towards was simply that the volunteers were perceived by them to be the first adults in their lives who'd ever wanted to spend time with them. The fact that somebody was a volunteer meant that they genuinely wanted to spend time with that young person in the young person's eyes. Completely different from social workers, completely different from foster carers, not doing any of those groups down, but the fact that they received financial remuneration for what they did tainted the credibility in the eyes of the client group in a way that volunteers did not. Literally, if we paid volunteers, we would have lost that credibility. So incredibly powerful and important. And I'm sure you can come up with examples from your own experience as well. This one we definitely touched on. They extend the sphere of influence. You know, if your organization has, I don't know, 400 paid staff and 40,000 volunteers, then clearly you have a bigger reach into your community through your volunteers than you do through your paid staff. Adjust those numbers of paid staff and volunteers accordingly, and the principle holds true for your organisation. They bring a sense of objectivity. Certainly here in the UK, the legal principle that nobody on as a trustee of a charity should by default be paid is baked into charity law for the very reason that volunteers bring a sense of objectivity. All trustees are volunteers, unless in exceptional circumstances, and they're not gaining a kind of vested financial interest in the organisation as a result. Also, sometimes it means that volunteers are not necessarily on the career ladder within the organisation, and so aren't concerned with some of those things and can provide a different perspective accordingly. Volunteers bring a luxury of focus. One of the lovely things, as I'm sure you will know from being volunteers yourselves, is that in whatever role you do, you can go in, you can concentrate on doing that volunteer role. You don't have to worry about the organisation, politics, bigger issue changes that are going on. You can just concentrate on the task that you're there to perform. It's a lovely advantage. It's also why volunteers sometimes can be the least or the most, resistant to change. And we have to work harder to help them to understand that. Whoops. They are free to criticise. Tell yourself over and over again, that is a good thing. That is a good thing. Because sometimes when volunteers criticise, and the way that they sometimes criticise, it doesn't always feel like a good thing. But the very fact that they are perhaps not on the career ladder and therefore have that sense of objectivity and can raise their voice separate from paid staff can, in fact, be a really, really powerful thing. Sometimes I think we underutilize that in volunteer engagement. If our services are being cut, if our budgets are being slashed, then we could be mobilizing our volunteers to speak up on behalf of volunteer engagement and to advocate to leadership about why cutting investment in volunteering is a short-sighted thing. They are a great way to experiment. My standard joke there is that I'm not encouraging you to experiment on your volunteers, although we do have volunteers in medical research, so if that's your bag, continue to do so. But they're a great way to try new things. The reality is that almost every single non-profit in the world, not all of them, but almost all of them, was started by a group of people that came together that wanted to experiment with a new way to change the world. It is the very definition of how non-profits, charities, voluntary organisations are created. In fact, one could even argue, as indeed Susan did many, many years ago, that volunteering is one of the best job creation schemes in history, rather than something that takes paid jobs away from people. And if we must be base and class and talk about money, they are a great way of extending the budget that we have. They are not free labour, and they are certainly not always cheap labour, but they are a great way of making the budget that we have go further. We also talk about second choice reasons. So these are reasons that you will hear people say. They're not wrong, I would argue some of them might be wrong, but they're not necessarily the ones that we want high up on our agendas, particularly when we're thinking about volunteer recruitment. So we're supposed to have them. Vast majority of our organisations, as I say, don't have it written into our governing documents that we are supposed to have volunteers, other than maybe on our board. They are a choice. We have chosen to engage volunteers for whatever reason. We've always had them. That doesn't mean you should always have them in future. I will let you just reflect quietly on the volunteers that you have in your organisation that you have always had and you wish you did not have any longer. Just because we've always had them doing certain things, certain tasks, doesn't mean that's the right way to do those things or tasks in future. And the one to avoid, if we're going to talk about money, is that we don't have sufficient resources to do our work without them, because the argument then is the moment we do have the resources, volunteers will be out the door and we'll find a different, in other words, better way of doing things. Volunteers aren't stupid. They will pick up on that, even if it's implicit, and they will respond accordingly. So what I would like you to do, just very briefly on a sheet of paper, a digital notepad, whatever it is that you have in front of you, a note-taking app, is reflecting on that just for a couple of minutes. Write down, if you had to now, gut instinct, pick 5 first choice reasons for involving volunteers in your organisation. Go back to what you put in the chat earlier. Just jot down at most on your sheet of paper and your notes app 5 reasons why you think your organisation would continue to involve volunteers if it had all the money it could ever need. 5 things that volunteers bring to your organisation that are unique to volunteers. So I'm just going to pause for a minute, partly to have a mouthful of water, but partly for you to write those down. And if you would like to share any of them in the chat, you would be very welcome to do so. And you can see what other people have said as well. It's got some more. Volunteers bring a wealth of work and lived experience. Really important, that one, Maureen, as we've said a couple of times already. And it's important then that we find the opportunities for volunteers to bring that wealth of worked and lived experience. Pathway to employment or further learning. Thank you, Bernie. Really good one. Kickstart projects that may well lead to paid jobs in the future. Yeah, great, Michelle. Thank you. Help address health inequalities. Really hone the customer experience. Yeah, that connection. Again, that can come with that luxury of focus, that the volunteer can just focus on the customer. Michelle's from a heritage organisation, so a visitor experience agenda in a way that maybe paid staff can't because they're distracted by other things. Community reach from beyond the bricks and mortar of the hospice, really, really good, especially as more hospice services go out into the community. Community, place-based perspective, sustainability and environmental issues, flexibility to make use of unexpected or unknown talents. Great, thank you for that one, Charlie. Really, really good. Keeping ourselves open to the potential that people may walk through the door with, rather than just thinking of roles that we want to plug people into. Really, really good. Passion for the cause, extending the reach, enhancing the delivery, fresh eyes and experience. Yep. And again, thank you, Marina. Usually super pleasurable to have volunteers alongside you in the work that you're doing. Absolutely. Absolutely. Really good stuff. They love to shout about our success. Yes. Love that one. So let's equip them to shout as loudly as possible rather than just hoping they'll do it. Make sure that we give them the tools and the information so that they can go out there and share. Fantastic. Remote working, giving reach to other communities. No, I love that one, Lindsay, knowing they can say how they really feel and not feel like they're being judged as if they were paid. Yeah. Getting that honesty, that can sometimes be really, really important. That was reflected both in the experience of Bowel Cancer UK and Sustrans in the Critical Friends. Actually, that's really, really important. Gives us access to diverse views and cultures. Thank you, Michelle. If you've not just you, Michelle, but anybody here, if you've not read the book Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed, I really, really encourage you to do so. I'm just going to put his name and the book in the chat. It's a really great book all about how our organizations are only going to benefit from a diversity of views, opinions, and experiences within our teams. Some really brilliant examples in there. Really, really good book to get. Thank you, everybody, for putting those in there. Just going to mention a couple of other things, and then we'll throw it over to questions. So please don't forget, you can put your questions in the Q&A section. Either Paula can ask those questions for you, or at the appropriate time, you may be able to jump out and shout your questions out online as well. So we talked about the reasons why we engage volunteers. Really important also to recognise reasons why we paid people. Again, these are not definitive. These are just 4 kind of headline reasons, again, that we talk about in From the Top Down. The first one is a predetermined number of work hours. So if you are an employee for your organisation, you hopefully have a contract of employment. Your contract of employment stipulates a number of hours that you are supposed to work each week. That number of hours bears absolutely no relation to the number of hours you actually work, but it was nice of the human resources team to take a stab at it. Much harder to do with volunteers. We cannot mandate volunteers to work 35, 40, 50 hours per week in the same way that we can with paid staff. Control over when those hours are worked, whether you have core hours, a flexi time system, shift work, depending on the nature of your organization and your setting. Again, much harder to create that kind of behavior with volunteers who can just be much more flexible and indeed want to be much more flexible these days. Control over the nature and priorities of the work. So you will have quite a clear job description as an employee that explains the boundaries of your role. Of course, we have role descriptions for volunteers, but they inevitably end up being more flexible based on the individual motivations of the volunteer concerned and how we might tweak that role accordingly. And then continuity. Continuity, somewhat laughably, as Angela's comment from earlier went about volunteers being more reliable than paid staff. But the reality is you will all have a contract of employment. In your contract will be something about your notice period, anything from a week maybe if you're new to maybe 3 to 6 months if you're senior enough and you've been there for a while. The reality is that a volunteer can just choose not to turn up one day and to continue not to turn up after that, and they don't have to let anybody know. So it's really important to understand not only why we engage people as volunteers, but also why we pay people. Because if we get that balance right, then we're actually starting again from a position of saying what work needs doing and who is best suited to do it, rather than paid staff do this, volunteers do that. And then when our budgets get cut, we start to encroach between those 2 sets of criteria and create problems for ourselves. So some practical things that I really encourage you to do after this session. We're going to open it up for questions in a minute, but some really practical things that I encourage you to do. If you have not done so ever in your organization or recently, perhaps within the last 5 years, is to start thinking about drafting a vision statement. Why is it that you think your organization would continue to engage volunteers even if it had access to all the money it could ever need? Consult and engage widely with that question. It's not my question. You can use that question. It's not trademarked. It's not copyrighted. You can absolutely use that question in your organization. Just remember, it's do you think your organization would involve volunteers, not does an individual, or would people still want to volunteer? And consult and engage widely. Talk to your board, talk to your senior leadership team, talk to middle management, talk to volunteers, talk to frontline staff. Get a variety of different opinions, shape that into a set of principles. Those kind of online word cloud tools, word cloud generators can be really, really important benefit to you in kind of pulling that phrasing together and seeing what really stands out. Refine and finalize it. So you will not get it right first time, but come up with something that is, you know, maybe your senior leadership team is happy to sign off at a senior level. Then publish it. Make sure everybody is aware of it and share it. Make sure all new starters get it. Make sure everybody is aware, everybody understands it, make sure it's used in strategic planning sessions, in setting people's objectives, all of those kinds of things, then review it regularly. Just because you've got one today in 2025 doesn't mean that that will be fit for purpose in 2028 or 2030. We know how quickly the world is changing around us. We know how quickly the context for our organizations is shifting, and we need to plan for that accordingly and adapt accordingly. The reasons why you might involve volunteers today are not necessarily the reasons why you might involve volunteers in a couple of years' time. So I'm going to throw that open for questions now. So again, please make sure you ask your questions in the Q&A rather than in the chat. I can see, Paula, that we've got one question so far, which is from Michelle.
Yeah. Michelle Armstrong. Hi, Michelle. From the Auckland Project, she asks, we are a diverse organization with some quite commercially driven elements. Is it just as important to ask why we wouldn't engage volunteers in some aspects of the business?
Really great question, Michelle. Yeah, I think it's important to ask that question. I think it's important to ask why volunteers would bring something unique, but also what might impinge on that uniqueness by involving them in some of those more commercial aspects of the business. I know, confession time, I know Michelle quite well. I've worked with Michelle on a number of occasions, and we're both involved in the Heritage Volunteering Group, so I know a little bit about Michelle's organisation and where she's coming from with that question. I think we need to be cautious, however, that we do not rule, and again, I know where you're coming from on this, Michelle, that we do not rule out the potential for volunteers in more commercial settings. You know, fundraising and charity retail, for example, are commercial settings, as I'm sure Julia from the Charity Retail Association, who's on this call, would agree. That doesn't mean volunteers should be excluded from that work, but it's important to understand why volunteers bring something unique and different to that work that isn't simply about cost saving and delivering a higher profit. So I think it's a valid question to ask, Michelle, but we'd be slightly cautious that it's not driven purely by avoiding volunteer involvement in commercial activity. We've got a couple more in there as well now, which is great. Yeah.
Vicky Sharp asks, hello, Rob. What advice would you give a coordinator manager who is struggling to explain the importance of having a volunteer strategy, which is shared across the organization? Many of my network only work part-time and haven't been afforded the resources to help them put something together.
Great question, Vicky. Thank you very much. What would explain the importance of having a volunteer strategy? So I suppose the important thing about having a volunteer strategy is if you don't have some sort of plan, some sort of strategy, some sort of clear understanding about the role that volunteers can play in contributing to the overall goal and mission of the organisation, things are left very unclear, very uncertain. I realise absolutely the part-time nature of people in your network. I'm sure the part-time nature of people who are on this call as well, and also that not everybody who works in volunteer engagement has got those strategic skills, has got that kind of strategic awareness and experience. I think it's really, if you don't know where you're going with something, then you're never really going to get where you want to go. So I think it's important to have that in there. I think it's also important, though, that this is where, and I would say this, wouldn't I? This is where you can look externally to see if there is the kind of support available to help you. So that might be through an organisation like yours, Vicky, Community First Yorkshire. It might be through a local volunteer centre. I'm actually hosting an event with my colleague Dan O'Driscoll here in the UK on the 30th of June. We're doing it with the Association of Volunteer Managers. It's going to be in Birmingham. And it's going to be a one-day for smaller to medium-sized organisations, so exactly the people you're talking about there, Vicky, to come together and learn the essential kind of tools for how we can develop a volunteering strategy and why it's important within an organisation. So I do think it's an important part of doing things, and I think we can kind of support people. I would very much recommend people have a look at From the Top Down, because even though it's aimed at senior leaders, I've certainly used this book myself in my career as a kind of a bit of a handbook about how I can influence around strategy within organizations. So some of those resources, you can equally go and have a look at the kind of blogs and podcasts that myself and others put out into the field. The Time for Impact podcast, Toby Johnson's podcast, the Volunteer Nation podcast, is a really, really good one as well, that will give you some, like, give your network some kind of practical tips, things to think about that would fit with their availability. But yeah, big challenge to do it when you're only part-time. I absolutely understand that.
And we have another question from Eliza
Yeah.
Gilbert. Any thoughts on the importance of having a paid staff member to manage a volunteer program as part of an organization's vision?
Many thoughts on that one. I would absolutely encourage any organization to invest in having a dedicated, experienced volunteer engagement professional to lead that activity. Going back to Vicky's question, again, recognize that resources might mean that has to be a part-time resource rather than a full-time resource. But I think a good volunteer engagement professional, whether they're working part-time or full-time, can really put the effort and the leadership in to elevating the work of volunteers within your organization. Some cautions around that is about not letting that person get caught up completely in the weeds of doing the day-to-day management of volunteer engagement. There are tools out there, Better Impact is indeed one of them, that are really, really useful in helping to elevate people away from dealing with the day-to-day, because the technology tools are there to help us deal with some of that day-to-day. It's also making sure that you bring somebody on and into that role who understands the kind of shifting context and environment for volunteering, and doesn't just think it's about getting lots of people who can give regular time commitments, and somebody who's confident enough to stir the pot a little bit, influence and effect change within an organization, as indeed we saw with Andy's quote earlier. So that was another great question. Thank you very much. Have we got more, Paula? What else have we got?
Yes. Ella Walker asks, hi, Rob. How do you make change when there is a strategy and the foundations for good volunteer involvement and program are there, but the volunteers' roles aren't? As in, there isn't a tangible thing that they want volunteers to do, despite many suggestions of tasks and roles.
Yeah, really interesting one. I mean, I would argue if the organization's got a volunteering strategy, that should be leading the development, or that should make clear what those roles are. Because if you know why you want to bring people together, if you know why you want to bring volunteers into the organization in the first place, and you know what the organization wants to achieve, you put those things together, that inevitably leads to the development of what those roles are. Maybe it's about thinking of it slightly differently, though. So I was with a group last week that was talking about thinking about less about roles within the organization and more about tasks and projects. So what are the specific tasks that maybe need to be done, aren't being done at the moment, would require specific skills, again, going back to the reasons why you involve people, or kind of really time-limited projects, which again might suit the kind of start, middle, end episodic nature of volunteering. Sometimes, as with the group I was working with last week, the idea of roles can be quite off-putting, not just for the volunteer, but also for the paid staff, as something that we've kind of got to maintain and we've got to keep going on a long-term basis. So maybe thinking about it more in a kind of task and done project kind of approach might be a helpful way of starting that off, and then some roles might flow out from that accordingly.
We have an anonymous question.
I've just seen that one.
What is your advice to those in the US who are dealing with large systemic changes impacting budgets across the government and nonprofit sector? How do you mobilize volunteers in this environment?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting one. I actually have a blog article coming out on this. I can't remember if it's the end of this week or next week. Well, kind of associated with this, which I think is about broadening our view of who volunteers are and what they do. We tend to think when we talk about volunteering, certainly those of us who've been around in the volunteering world for a long time, we tend to think about volunteers and volunteering in the context of those roles that we traditionally have within our organizations. We don't tend to recognize that advocacy, protesting, we even get as far as something like civil disobedience, is actually volunteer roles. You know, volunteers are the people who change the world. And Susan was very fond of saying, nobody gets paid to start a revolution. It's big societal changes and big societal shifts like that, and pushing back against some of the changes that aren't working is quite often down to volunteers. So I think it's about looking at how do we engage people who, again, are passionate about the organizations, passionate about the causes, but maybe stepping outside of the day-to-day role delivery and thinking more about advocacy, campaigning, protesting, doing all of those kinds of things. We've seen it in the way that, you know, the climate change agenda has been addressed. We've seen it in the way that things like LGBTQ plus agendas have been addressed. I think it can be used in a variety of different ways. Recognizing, as I say that, though, that I do not live in the United States. I observe it from 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic, but I have lots of friends who do live in the United States, and that increasingly that kind of role is one where a considerably higher act of bravery might need to be involved in it than in other countries around the world. And that may be something where people are quite literally putting their liberty on the line in order to be able to bring about the kind of change. So it's very easy for me to say that, but I recognize it's potentially a lot harder for some organizations to do. We have about 4 minutes left, so maybe we can grab a couple more questions.
More. Okay, Ian asks, our organization has just launched a new 5-year strategy. Is this a good time to start thinking about a volunteer strategy?
Absolutely, yes, 100%. I mean, ideally, you'd be developing the volunteer strategy alongside the organizational strategy, but these kinds of things don't always work neatly like that. So if the organization's got one, definitely having a volunteer strategy in place. The only caution that I would put out there, whether it's in relation to a volunteer strategy or an organizational strategy, we do love in the nonprofit sector our 5-year strategies and goals. I think 5 years is probably too far out these days for us to be planning. I think a kind of an aspiration for 5 years, but a reality to review probably every year, but certainly with a 2 to 3 year window. You know, a 5-year strategy that was set in 2016 would have had to have been radically reshaped in 2020 when COVID hit. A volunteer strategy or an organizational strategy that was written in 2020 would have had to have been radically rewritten for the way that the world was post-COVID and then the various different upheavals we'd had ever since. So definitely a good time to write one, but slight caution around trying to set out a plan for where we may be in 5 years' time when we may not actually know where we're going to be in 5 months' time. And maybe one more, Paula, and then I'll wrap up and hand back to you.
Yeah. Okay, last one. How would you respond if your organization decided to remove the volunteering specialist on the basis that the HR specialists are able to carry out the volunteering function as effectively? Asking for a friend.
Yeah, asking for a friend. Yeah, brilliant. Well, having been involved in 2 events, one in November last year and one in April of this year, in Swindon and York in the UK, where we, myself and a couple of other colleagues, brought together HR professionals from organizations where they had an integrated volunteering function, integrated being they just had the volunteer team within the HR team through to there was no difference. There are a variety and a range of different answers to that question. I would always be slightly cautious about the assumption that because volunteers are people and paid staff are people, then HR can just manage everything, can't they? Because it fails to acknowledge the way in which volunteer engagement is fundamentally different than paid staff management, because we do not pay people. The old adage of we should treat our volunteers like our paid staff is wrong. We should be treating our paid staff like our volunteers. But also, I think because of the changing nature of volunteering, where it's becoming much more community-based, it's becoming much more community action-led rather than the traditional HR-style approach, means that that isn't necessarily kind of community involvement, community engagement are not necessarily naturally skills that HR teams have. And therefore, by integrating volunteering within HR increasingly, because they're just people, might actually be missing a fundamental way in which volunteering is changing. Those were all great questions. Thank you, everybody. And I see some things in the chat as well. So thank you all for that. Just one final thing from me before I hand over to Paula to wrap the hour up. And it has flown by, is my contact details. Again, you will get this slide as part of your handout. Email is generally the best way to get in touch. But I just want to draw your attention to that link tree at the bottom, because that will take you to a link to the From the Top Down book, as well as the other book that I've written, the Complete Volunteer Management Handbook. But more importantly, it will take you to my social media presences, my blog, the podcast, which we're in the middle of recording the 4th series for, which will launch on the 1st of September, and a bunch of other free resources around volunteer engagement. So please feel free, if you're not already connected, to reach out and do so on social media, but also check those resources out for further tips and advice.